Okay, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here today. Today I'll be talking about a particular project that I have around Latino neighborhoods and transit-oriented development. Actually, this project has 6 case studies, but I decided to start with the MacArthur Park case study because I know a lot about MacArthur Park. I grew up in MacArthur Park. I wrote my dissertation on MacArthur Park, and I wrote a book about MacArthur Park. And I actually think that the transit-oriented development led to some really positive circumstances and changes in MacArthur Park. I do research in inner city neighborhoods around urban regeneration issues. I also do research in meatpacking communities around kind of rural regeneration issues. And now that I'm in Oregon, I'm doing research in rural communities as well. But this is really the conceptual question that pretty much guides all of my research. And that's how do the institutional and social cultural context within these Latino low-income immigrant communities help them reshape large-scale redevelopment projects in a more equitable and generative fashion. And that's really the kind of key question that I kind of always ask myself when I'm doing my research. I think there's a problem when it comes to redevelopment. Some of those who are trying to define what redevelopment is. And the problem that you could trace this historically to, I would argue to the progressive, but also during urban renewal. And this is that when you're trying to improve these communities, that actually leads to some potential displacements, potential gentrification in these areas. So this is kind of a key question that I think definitely is an issue in the planning field. And I try to find cases where this hasn't occurred because I want to look for these kind of exemplary cases and say something, something positive about revitalization, and also something positive about kind of bottom-up processes in these communities. In this project, I'm speaking specifically to transportation planners. So the way I frame this is in a similar way. If you look at historically, transportation projects, large-scale transportation projects have also led to a lot of disruption in these low-income communities. Just think about the constructions of freeways, for example, in the Latino community in particular. If you look at East LA, the construction of freeways displace people, they disconnect the communities physically. And kind of the framing I'm starting to kind of uncover about TODs is that if they're done in a different way, if they're done by actually paying attention to the endogenous resources and organizations that exist in these communities, they might actually serve as a way to connect these communities. So the purpose of the study was really to uncover how a large-scale transit-oriented development project in the low-income Latino community contributed to neighborhood revitalization, okay, in kind of equitable and more positive way. So let me introduce you to MacArthur Park. It's about a mile west of downtown Los Angeles. With all the revitalization that's occurring in downtown Los Angeles, there's a lot of pressures for redeveloping MacArthur Park. It has this beautiful public space at the center of the neighborhood. MacArthur Park was one of the original public parks of the city of Los Angeles. And actually, so you see where it says sites, that's the site of the transit-oriented development. When I first started studying MacArthur Park as an undergraduate, I thought that the opening up of the subway station, along with a very top-down type of approach that the planners were taking, were going to lead to the displacement of the community. When I went back to do my dissertation, I kind of realized that didn't happen. So that really kind of sparked my interest and I started to try to uncover why that was. But the initial project was really this transit-oriented development project that was going to be linked to the condominium, the development of condominiums, development of high-end kind of retail. Okay, so the planners were really thinking about changing the neighborhood. This is the way the neighborhood kind of grew in the 1980s. It was really the hub of crime and of kind of drug activity in Los Angeles. I think in one year, in the mid-80s, there was about 100 homicides just in the neighborhood themselves. It was also the origin of MS-13, which is Mata Salvatrucha, which is this very kind of notorious transnational gang now. It actually started in MacArthur Park as well. And the police were also doing some pretty bad, scandalous things, and they got caught by the FBI. So this made a couple of times. They were actually confiscating drugs in the neighborhood and reselling the drugs, doing a lot of abuses in terms of the immigrants. And so this was the environment. So this was the environment that existed when the planners had this top-down kind of vision of the transit development in the community. So MacArthur Park is mostly a low-income Latino community. Most of the immigrants come from Mexico, Guatemala, and El Salvador. I see it as a gateway community, and so it's one of these kind of centers where Central Americans come into the U.S. and then they go to other places, especially in the LA region. So there's two kind of bodies of literature that I'm trying to combine and get something out of. I'm not fully there yet, but anyways, one is the transit-oriented development. So for those that are not familiar with this, it's basically linking transportation infrastructures to more dense housing and commercial development in the area. Okay? And the idea behind that is that you're going to create more dense spaces, more livable spaces, and so forth. A lot of the debates in this literature deal with measuring the impacts around that, and whether actually these transportation systems do anything there. The other literature I'm dealing with is the Latino urbanist literature. Okay? And this literature basically argues that Latinos are transforming physical spaces through their cultural, through culture. So Michael Rios just wrote a book, Placemaking in Latino Communities, where he makes these arguments. Jesus Lara is linking new urbanist principles to how Latinos go about remaking their communities. I've written actually a critique of Latino urbanism, where I argue that they focus too much on the cultural features and do not focus on the structural issues that create the conditions that manifest themselves through those cultural issues. So those are the two bodies of literature that I'm trying to grapple with. In order to kind of understand what's happening in these communities, I've kind of gravitated to Cornelius Flores' theory of community capitalist framework. She's a rural sociologist. She looks at rural communities as having different forms of assets, so different forms of financial capital, political capital, social capital, and cultural capital. And today I'm going to focus on the political capital that existed in MacArthur Park and on the cultural capital that also exists in MacArthur Park. And I'm making this argument that it's really these endogenous forms of capital that exist in these neighborhoods that help these neighborhoods sustain these large-scale transportation infrastructure projects. This is my main research question. So how can large-scale TLD projects contribute to the revitalization of low-income Latino communities? So first I want to start off with the political capital that existed in this neighborhood. And this is really important because when I've been studying these rural communities, there's not a lot of political capital that Latinos possess in these communities. And I think that in many ways that kind of hampers the type of influence that they can have in their revitalization efforts. But in MacArthur Park, it's very different. Okay? MacArthur Park has a history of progressive local Latino politicians that have really kind of taken a stand and tried to reshape the types of projects that were occurring in that neighborhood. So the first one was Gloria Molina. She used to be the city councilwoman in MacArthur Park. She was the first person that really took a stand against that initial top-down transit-oriented development that really kind of threatened the neighborhood. She couldn't really do much about it until she became a county supervisor, and she served on the role of the Metropolitan Transportation Agency. So from that perspective, there's a really interesting story actually that she told me where the planners basically came in with their sketches and they had all the plans ready, and she basically kind of threw them out and said, we're not going to do this. And kind of forced them to go back to the drawing board and do something that was a little bit more community oriented. Ed Reyes was the council member that just stepped down about a year ago. He was really involved. He's a planner trained at UCLA. He was really involved in this day labor center. I'm not going to talk about the day labor center today. I go into details on that in my book, but it was a way to kind of formalize the informal relationships that existed in this community. And there's a lot of these informal relationships. So that one focuses on the day labor center. The other informal relationships that exist are the street vendors in MacArthur Park. So MacArthur Park is this hub of street vending in Los Angeles as well. Mike Hernandez and Reyes, both of them again were council members. They decided to start LA's first formal street vending district. This was in the mid-'80s. So I'll focus on that. And someone mentioned affordable housing before. Ed Reyes, so the city council members in Los Angeles have power over land use. And Ed Reyes really put a lot of pressure on developers with the help of community-based organizations in the area to force a lot of affordable housing projects in the neighborhood. In fact, the transit-oriented development is all affordable housing. They have about 100 units of affordable housing linked to that. But I'm going to focus on street vending. So this was approved, actually it was in the mid-'80s, sorry. It was initially in the mid-'90s, approved in 1999. There's hundreds of street vendors in MacArthur Park. The usual response of government to street vending is to get rid of the street vending. Here, LA decided to take a different approach, and they tried to formalize these street vendors. They worked with different community-based organizations like Mamas Hot Tamales to try to create a project that would serve, so Mamas Hot Tamales would serve as a kitchen incubator for the vendors. Then they would get permits from the health department, the city's health department, to be able to sell their goods out there. And at first it was actually a very difficult project to get off the ground because a lot of the bureaucracy that existed within the city. They were able to push about 100 permits. There was hundreds of vendors in MacArthur Park. So that kind of created a lot of competition between the vendors. So these were the street vending carts. They're very, very attractive, kind of culturally, appropriate or lively and so forth. But at the same time, when you try to formalize a lot of these informal activities, you create this stagnant kind of outcome, and that's exactly what happened. So the other street vendors were able to undercut them. Because they could go directly to their markets, they could sell their goods at a cheaper rate and so forth. So the project lasted a few years and then it was discontinued. But I think it's still an example of a local city council member trying to kind of think outside the box and trying to kind of keep the community there intact. The other form of capital that I'll focus on is cultural capital. And I think this cultural capital is manifested in different ways in MacArthur Park. Through cultural celebrations and parades of Feria Agostina brings thousands of people to the park in August. It's a celebration there. I'm also going to talk about the transformation of public spaces, particularly the transformation of the park from a very kind of passive to a very active type of park, and the role that the city council played within that. And then the construction of the Oscar Romero Plaza. So this is a community organizer, and here he's talking about how his organization tries to work with the city council member to create this cultural milieu in the area. He's saying for Central Americans, it's the Central American capital of the world because there is no real capital in Central America, a region comprised of countries. But here in Los Angeles, you find the Central American capital of the world as a living community, including Garifunas. Okay, so he's arguing that in MacArthur Park, this is where you actually get this diaspora of Central Americas, and it creates these kind of new identities. As I mentioned, we have different types of Central American parades and kind of cultural expressions. This is another community organizer. He says his job is to hold cultural events in the park, so you're bringing in something that they're familiar with in their homelands. They really try to have this overall type feeling. That when people stroll through the park and enjoy a tamale or a spa that they're selling, to be able to sit in the park and enjoy entertainment from all these different Central American countries. Okay, so you're creating this kind of cultural milieu that I argue serves as an anchor. When you do your redevelopment, you always need some sort of anchor to redevelop something around it. Usually people talk about hospitals or you talk about some sort of shopping center or something. So I'm arguing that you can do revitalization, especially kind of bottom-up revitalization, through cultural anchor. And sometimes that manifests itself politically. Okay, so MacArthur Park is also the center for, one of the centers for immigrant rights activities in Los Angeles. This was the big immigration rights march in 2006. It started in downtown LA. It had about 100,000 people, and they marched. It ended in MacArthur Park. It's also a manifestation of the importance of the public space in the area. And the police actually cracked down on people, and it became this really big scandal. The Mayday rally. So the other kind of cultural manifestation here relates to the use of public spaces. I just published an article with my colleague Kelly May. She did her dissertation on MacArthur Park. I was doing my dissertation on MacArthur Park. We didn't know each other until a few years back, so we decided to collaborate on an article. That was that urban studies article. And so she really focused on the use of public space and how Latinos were able to transform this very passive park to a very active one. And then I started to focus on the role that the local government had in doing this. And it was interesting because the historical preservationists, they basically wanted to keep the park as a passive park, even though people weren't really using it. You know, the Latinos were the ones that were starting. This is an informal soccer league that exists in the park. And you know, and then the city council member decided to not regulate it, and decided to let the informal leagues kind of let them play their games and so forth. And then they even worked to do some physical upgrades to the area. So they basically negotiated with the historical preservationists, and they made the soccer fields into a meadow. Okay? Even though these kind of look like soccer fields, but officially in the plans they're a meadow, because the historical preservationists didn't want to go that far, I guess. But now they have hundreds of kids on the weekends that play in MacArthur Park. So this issue again of how political capital kind of interacts with the social capital, and how the issues of informality are kind of regulated within this space. The last example is Oscar Romero Plaza. Oscar Romero was our Archbishop of El Salvador. He was assassinated while giving mass. So he represents a kind of a cultural icon for Salvadorians, especially Salvadorians that were affected by the Civil War, which actually there's a lot that live around MacArthur Park. And so a community-based organization was able to get about 5,000 signatures to dedicate this plaza to them. And the local city council members, obviously, again, really kind of pushed for that as well. The other plaza, the other statue in the park is a General MacArthur. Okay, so it kind of tells you the kinds of changes, the physical changes that are happening. So one of my arguments is that yes, Latinos are kind of through their placemaking aspects, through using their different forms of social capital, are physically transforming these types of spaces. So this is how MacArthur Park looks today. I took this picture the last time I was down there. Yeah, it's amazing. I grew up there, and I just can't imagine how it transformed that way. Okay, so when I talk to the transportation planners, I give them a kind of a basic message, which is, okay, if you want to make these transit-oriented development projects actually benefit the community, you have to pay attention to different forms of endogenous capital that exist in these areas. You got to pay attention to the cultural, political, financial forms and the build capital in the neighborhoods. You have to rely on more bottom-up participatory forms of decision-making and kind of activism in the neighborhood. And you also kind of have to look for these kind of tangible outcomes. So providing access to a regional transportation system, focusing a lot on affordable housing, encouraging diverse local businesses, different kind of social services in the area. But these things are not just going to happen. They have to actually be pushed by the community themselves. And that's kind of where my research is leading, is to really kind of uncover what that context is and how different community members can really kind of push for these types of outcomes. These are my other case studies. So I'm comparing MacArthur Park to the Fruitville Transit Village in Oakland. That one focuses a lot on social services. I've already completed that case study. So right now I'm writing an article comparing and contrasting the MacArthur Park case study to the Fruitville one. I also have another one in Los Angeles, in East LA, the Pico Aliso project, and that one is going to focus on affordable housing. In that area, you had public housing. Well, first of all, you had a community that was displaced to build public housing, and then you had the public housing people that were somewhat displaced to build the Hope 6 project. Okay, so that's what Lawrenceville calls double displacement. Okay, so that's I'm focusing on issues of affordable housing and how TOD is linked to that because they also link it to a TOD. I have one in South LA that deals with retail, but it really deals with like swap meets. And when you go to that TOD, you wouldn't think that it was a successful one, but you just walk one block and you have 4 blocks full of swap meets. So that's my retail focus one. And then I have one in San Diego in Chicano Park. And for those of you that don't know Chicano Park, it's a very important kind of center for activism in the Chicano community. So in the 70s, the community was destroyed by, well, it was trying to be destroyed by the construction of freeways. The community stood up. They built a public space underneath the freeway, and it's, they filled it with political murals and so forth. So it's a very important kind of place for the Chicano community. And the TOD is right there. You can see it actually, right near the freeway there. So I'm trying to understand that. And then I have one in Hillsboro, Oregon. And now I'm looking at TOD as from a new destination kind of perspective. And what I'm trying to understand is how TOD is different in Latino communities than it is in other communities. So thank you very much.
Rumors are flying about, the police can stop you at any point, and that actually turned out to be quite true in some cases. Not really knowing the full story. So I think you're right that right after that there was an English-only law that was trying to be passed in Nashville. And if you think about 2007, 2008, the just really harsh national level discourse around kind of anti-immigrant sentiment. What my sense was is that a lot of immigrants really pulled life in. And so things that would have been public or might have taken place in public spaces in the city or parks or on the streets or outside in your neighborhood really came in as people kind of hunkered down. And then on top of that, you have the financial crisis. So it was like this double whammy that really hit communities quite hard, and it just made them much less visible. And it made a lot of the organizations working with immigrants just constantly trying to put out fires, like much bigger fires, and trying to create dialogue in the neighborhoods. I think you're right, it had to be the opposite of that.
Yeah, just so quickly, like I guess a lot of my applied work actually deals with public participation issues and how to get people involved in the planning process. And I think this relates to the MacArthur Park work, but also to your question about the kind of the context of anti-immigrant and undocumented kind of workers. So I have a project right now where I directly focus on doing public engagement in unauthorized communities. And it's very difficult to do that in a very public setting. And basically my strategy is to actually go to the communities themselves and to where they work, live, play, worship, and actually set up these very non-coercive ways of engaging them. I won't get into the details of what the method is. But from that, then get their information and get them involved in the planning process in a very kind of, in a very, not in a covert way, but in a way that doesn't put them at more risk. So that's my applied work.
Here, and then over there.
I just wanted to pick up on the idea of narrative and thinking about the busing and the black-white dynamic coloring how whites in your area see what's going on, and wondering if there isn't a new narrative emerging now in which undocumented status is now coming to define Latino identity for many whites, and seeing everything kind of through that prism, and the degree to which you might have seen that.
I think one of the things about the field work I did is it was really catching, one of the things about new destinations is you're constantly catching some process and formation. Every phase of an immigrant experience is the first. So, the first of U.S.-born immigrant children going into schools. And so in 2007, there were some people who were mobilizing the kind of discourse of legality, but it wasn't the lens through which this issue is being seen, in part because, again, these are white, working class neighborhoods where immigration has only recently become an issue. I think if I went back now and did the same kind of interview, that national discourse has worked its way into local explanations. I think you're right that narrative is going to change, that frame is going to change over time.
Yeah, if I could address that really quickly. One of my other projects was in Postville, Iowa, where I traced the transnational connections between immigrants that got deported there. There was about 400 immigrants. It's one of the larger rates in U.S. history. So I went to Guatemala, to the communities where they got deported, and interviewed people and identified the transnational kind of links that unauthorized workers use. But anyways, I've been really immersed in this community. And yeah, I mean, mostly other Latinos in Postville. This is a town of 2,000 people. We're undocumented. They deported about half of those, so it really led to a lot of disruptions in the town as well. So for me, I think that narrative is okay because I think it needs to be addressed. I think we're at a critical time where immigration policy seems like it gets going and then it kind of backs off. So I think the more attention that can be drawn to that, the better. Because that's like a practical thing. But I can see how other Latinos that are not, or that can be offended by this.
In terms of policing, the people's a problem.
Right.
There's a question there. Go ahead.
I don't know if you told me this morning is the Albanian immigration. And I live in a working class neighborhood. And the late 90s, early 2000s, there was substantial immigration from Albania. And apparently there were different groups that we had not even realized. And I'm a kind of newcomer to the neighborhood myself. But it was very interesting, the culture of the Albanians. First of all, some of the people that were different culture and a different ethnic background than the residents said, well, if you like anything about this neighborhood, it's the Albanian road. And they are very entrepreneurial. They came in, looked for opportunities, and fixed up houses, whatever. And as soon as they felt they had done well enough, they moved out. And they moved out like en masse, I mean, it's just amazing. And they may have held onto some of the properties, rental properties, but they themselves don't want to do it because they felt that the local white working class were holding them back. And they were discriminating against the kids in schools and so on. And in opinion about this as white, as come here. And it was kind of interesting process to see. And then when you looked into the Albanian community and so on, we could see different clans in there and different issues, like some people who might have been a police captain in the original moved to scare the rest of the Albanian of the West, but anyway, they moved on and they have not shed any tears, but moving on. So that was kind of fantastic. And the neighborhood now is very much gentrified. And I can see the influence of the Albanians themselves. And they run down houses, fixing them up, release their labor and so on.
We'll take one last question. The gentleman who's had his hand up several times.
Thank you very much for this question. I wonder if there's sort of continuing this conversation around narrative a little bit. Thinking about media as both a reflection and a shaper of these conversations and the differences between your two cases, which have historical roots, but I think there's also media plays a role here because in the Los Angeles context, there's both local and Spanish language media, but also on the pages of the LA Times, the local news, the kind of big mainstream media having conversations about Latino identity and Latino culture. I would imagine those kinds of conversations don't happen in quite the same way in the Nashville context. And so just have sort of an open question about what role is media playing here, and have you seen the narrative shaped or reshaped by media flows, both at a larger level and in the local or ethnic media context?
I think media representations played a key role in the area that I was looking at, especially in terms of putting some of these neighborhoods on the map as where immigrants in the city live, because Southeast Nashville is bordered by interstates and a lake. So if you didn't grow up there, you just drive by it. So most people living in the city spend no time there. So when the city's main newspaper does front page stories of Woodbine is Nashville's little Mexico. Look at all these Mexican restaurants. Look at this change. That community suddenly becomes visible in a way that really contradicts how long-term residents see this place. They see this as the heart of salt of the earth, white, working class Nashville. So media played a role there. And certainly in the remapping of places like Cane Ridge. You heard over and over, every time Antioch is in the news, it's a crime, it's a murder, it's something. And so that sort of conflation of this place and criminal activities or gangs or a mall that nobody wanted to go to certainly shaped, they were certainly motivating factors for the ways that long-term residents were trying to redefine what this place meant.
And just it seems the voice of the immigrant community is not coming through.
No.
In a way that I think in Los Angeles, in the MacArthur Park situation, it does, in really dramatic and important ways.
So I've actually met with Monica Lozano, who's the owner of La Opinion. And so that's like a ethnic media, multi-million, I don't know, whatever, but it's a very kind of powerful media outlet. And I think that shows the difference between MacArthur Park and the other communities I study. So like in Oregon and Iowa, they're the ethnic media is, and it is present actually, but it's a little bit more kind of, not underground, but it really serves like an immigrant integration purpose. Okay, they have these little ethnic newspapers that have stories about community events, about what's going on in the community. So it's, there's different layers, I guess, of that.
Part of what has happened, and this I think happens in a lot of new destinations, there is an institutional gap between organizations, grassroots and otherwise, that speak for and represent the neighborhood. This is our place, this is what we do, and institutions that represent communities. So you have in Nashville organizations that work with refugees and immigrants, but it's not place-based. So representations of Antioch, that's not their fight. Then you have neighborhood-based organizations that are getting lots of encouragement from the city, which is trying to put forth drawing on the urbanism, neighborhood-based governance, and they are speaking for the place. Well, immigration and immigrant settlement, you talked about community. If immigrants living in multiple neighborhoods who may or may not see themselves as part of a community, who are being represented by organizations that are talking about the international community. And so these kinds of issues just fall between the cracks. It's just this institutional gap in terms of how the city and discourse is organized.
So we only went 4 minutes over, and he doesn't.